We are back with the other top story tonight. Donald Trump ramping up his attacks on none other than his own appointed Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, saying in a new interview, "I don't have an Attorney General." It's very sad. Later, he would not answer if he's going to fire Sessions.
I'm disappointed in the Attorney General for numerous reasons, but we have an Attorney General. I'm disappointed in the Attorney General for many reasons, and you understand that. We are looking at lots of different things.
And then he went on to say this about Paul Manafort.
Are you concerned about what Paul Manafort will tell investigators?
No, I'm not. I'm not, because if he's honest, and he is, I think he's going to tell, as long as he tells the truth, it's 100%. I don't want to talk about it now.
With me now, Paul Butler, a former federal prosecutor, and Matt Miller, former spokesperson for the Justice Department. Paul, to you first. President Trump saying, "I don't have an Attorney General." Well, that's absolutely not true. What he doesn't have is a personal fixer in Jeff Sessions.
That's right, Stephanie. The president's problem is that he has an attorney general who understands that the Justice Department represents the United States and not Donald Trump. The president is mad for, among other reasons, Sessions didn't recuse himself from the Russian investigation, but Sessions had a gaping conflict of interest. Sessions lied to the Congress about his own involvement with the Russians. So how could he supervise that investigation? Ultimately, Stephanie, the president's beef isn't with Sessions. The president's beef is with the rule of law.
Okay, Matt, why does he continue to rip on Jeff Sessions? Why not just fire him? Because one of the issues he faces is Jeff Sessions' agenda is actually the policy agenda that suits many Republicans. Jeff Sessions is a lifelong Republican. The issue where these two don't see eye to eye is the Russia investigation, which voters don't have as a priority.
Yeah, that's right. And if you look at what Jeff Sessions has done, it's not just been his policy agenda, but really on a number of other things in terms of politicizing the department. He has bent over backwards to accommodate Donald Trump in every way he possibly can. You know, he's ordered up internal investigations. He's asked prosecutors to comb through some of the conspiracy theories that Donald Trump has advanced. The one thing he can't do is just blatantly violate DOJ laws by inserting himself into things he's recused from or ordering up criminal investigations when there's no criminal predicate.
So why doesn't Trump just fire him? The one thing he's not doing is hooking him up on the Russia investigation.
I think there are two things. I think up until now, Trump has felt like he's constrained by the Republican majority in the Senate, where Sessions has, until the last few months, had deep and long-lasting support. And I don't think he's been able to figure out a fix going forward. So it's one thing to fire Jeff Sessions, but just elevating Rod Rosenstein into the Attorney General job doesn't get Trump what he really wants. Rod Rosenstein isn't going to fire Mueller. Rod Rosenstein isn't going to shut down the investigation. And I doubt Trump has been able to figure out a way to get someone into that job.
Wait, you don't think Rudy Giuliani could get confirmed?
I don't think Rudy Giuliani can confirm, but I would say there's another problem too, which is, you know, there are ways he could move other officials from inside the government into the job in an acting position. I doubt he's found someone yet who's willing to be that blatantly political to go and shut down the Mueller probe.
That is a wow. I want to play what Hillary Clinton told Rachel Maddow last night, specifically about firing people after the midterms.
What I worry about, Rachel, is that after this election, this president's going to wholesale fire people. That's my prediction for tonight, like my prediction from last year. And if we don't have one or both houses of Congress in place, he will be even more uncontrollable and unaccountable. He will fire people in the White House. He will fire people in his administration who he thinks are crossing him, questioning him, undermining him.
Wow. Well, I don't know if Hillary Clinton has a crystal ball. That's worrisome. Paul, do you think wholesale firings are a possibility?
Stephanie, that would be the real witch hunt. It would be reminiscent of the 50s, in which they were trying to purge all these alleged communists, and all of these innocent, hardworking people got caught up in that investigation. You know, one interesting thing we saw today is that the president now is coming out with new reasons to fire Sessions. He brought up immigration for the first time. To Matt's point, immigration actually would be a good reason to fire Sessions. He was the biggest cheerleader for that cruel family separations policy, but we all know that's not the president's concern.
Trump supports those policies.
Exactly.
They were his zero tolerance policies that were only reversed after the media attention.
The irony is that Sessions is probably the most effective cabinet member at carrying out the president's agenda.
Not if you're talking about a president who wants to put himself first. He certainly doesn't like Russia, Russia, Russia. Paul, Matt, thank you so much.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.